What do you say about Mike Cochran? Well, I have some prepared remarks, but, you know, I mean, Texas Newspaper Foundation Hall of Fame, all the books that he's written, I'm not going to reiterate them. They'll go through some of those in my remarks, but he's been a friend for 35 years. He spent the night in the publisher of the Star-Telegram's bed, Phil Meek, many years before. I ask you to join me in showing your thanks and applause to a man who has made journalism in Texas, in reality, journalism in our nation, much of what it is today, in an industry too often today noted for its lack of nobility. It is good to reflect on those that to this day whose name is equated with the best in journalism. From all of us, Mike, I say congratulations. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm blushing. Stop. I don't know who he was talking about. I thought he was going to introduce me. Although some had retired or would soon move on, this group included guys and gals like Mike Blackman, who you heard from indirectly, Jerry Flemons, Carolyn Perot, Jeff Gwynn, Jack Douglas Jr., Galen Wilkins, Roger Summers, Jim Jones, Jimmy Birch, Bob Ray Sanders, Melody McDonald, and, of course, Bud Kennedy. I don't know. There's something else. I can't say enough about how much Mike Blackman helped me write a half dozen or so books, officially and unofficially editing several of them. There is no finer researcher. I get a little choked up here. No finer researcher, writer, and editor than Mike Blackman, whose numerous newspaper jobs included a stint as editor of the Star-Telegram. And I could offer pretty much the same praise about the legendary writer-author Jerry Flemons and my current friend and former Texas AP Bureau Chief John Lumpkin of Dallas. One of the highlights of my newspaper job was writing the byline text of the Star-Telegram's terrific book, Shattered, the staff-produced classic of the March 2000 Tarrant County tornadoes. Shattered was won a highly respected Katie Award. Another highlight was co-authoring the coffee table book, West Texas, with John Lumpkin. Flemons plugged the book thusly, quote, "This is the only coffee table book anybody will actually read." Of course, it had wonderful photos in it. And a lot from Ron Heflin, the former Star-Telegram and Associated Press photographer. A great one, Pulitzer Prize winner. I've been asked often what inspired me to pursue a writing career, and I believe it actually traces back to my mother, who gave me an early appreciation of the written word. She'd even edit my letters that I wrote her during the summers I worked as a kid in Oklahoma. She was a school teacher in the small but colorful little West Texas town of Stanford, north of Abilene. She had me reading library books when I was in grade school, and I developed a love for books early on. Before I was a teenager, I had read all the Hardy Boy and Nancy Drew kids' mysteries, and I naturally advanced to adult books, mostly mysteries early on. I think I've kind of eased into writing at our high school paper and later at the college newspapers at first Hardin Simmons and then at North Texas State College in Denton, now the University of North Texas. And speaking of North Texas, I'll share a story that got a great response when I told it to a group of journalists the night I was inducted into the Texas Newspaper Foundation Hall of Fame in Galveston. It involved the late Cecil Shuford, who we all knew as Pop Shuford, the longtime head of the North Texas Department of Journalism. Most all of us loved, admired, and feared Pop, who was a renowned poetry author as well as a national journalism figure. He and Dallas writer-author Hugh Ainsworth were two of my major journalistic inspirations. My mother went to Hardin-Simmons to get her master's as I graduated from high school in Stanford. And so I got I started working for the Hardin-Simmons newspaper some, and thought I was really getting to be a great journalist. And I transferred to North Texas right before Hardin-Simmons kicked me out of school. And I loved North Texas, and I had a wonderful time, and I was learning and everything, except my first experience at North Texas with Pop Shuford, and I was taking feature writing, and we turned in those little small stories called Brights that often would appear on the front page. They were usually really clever writing and whatever, and this one called Brights, B-R-I-T-E-S. And as luck would have it, like I say, I was brand new at North Texas, but when Pop Shuford started reading these Brights to the class, we were all in the class, he just, I say by accident, I assume it was by accident, but anyway, he started off with My Bright. And I was sitting there toward the front of the room, and I was smiling at him, and I was thinking, boy, this is great. And he read it, and he looked at me, and he smiled again, and he took My Bright, and he wadded it up, tossed it on the floor, stomped on it, and came up with a barnyard comment that begins with bull. So that was my introduction to Pop. But I came to admire him mightily, and and when I was I was in my senior year, and he had actually got me an intern, one deal with a newspaper in the summer. And but at any rate, 6 weeks before I was to graduate, I got my grandfather was an oil man in Oklahoma, a very successful one, and he had done some work with Sohia Oil Company, and had been a big money deal and whatever. So 6 weeks before I was to graduate, I got an offer from Sohia for a public relations job at $150 a week. In 1958, that was enormous. So when I got the offer, I ran down the hall to Pop Shuford's office. I ran in and told him, I said, look, listen to this. I have got the greatest offer you could ever imagine. I'm going into public relations for Sohia Oil Company. I'm going to be making $150 a week. And he smiled at me and listened as I babbled on. And then he said, well, actually, Mike, you're not. I said, what do you mean I'm not? He says, you're going to work for the Denton Record Chronicle. In fact, you're starting next week before you graduate. And you're going to, I said, what do you mean? He says, well, you're going to work part-time. Just work part-time, and then when you graduate, you'll go on full-time. And I said, well, wait a minute. What are you saying? I said, what am I going to make? What are they going to pay me? He says, they're going to pay you $1 an hour till you graduate, but then they're going to kick it up to $60 a week. And I said, Pop, you mean I'm taking a $90 a week pay cut on my first job? And he says, yeah. And I said, yeah, that's just crazy. And he says, well, Mac, one of these days, you'll thank me. Okay. I went to work for the Record Chronicle. And then I was offered a job at Abilene Reporter News. Well, actually to Corpus Christi, and my wife, Sandra, and I were going to move to Corpus. And I loved sports, and that's what it was, a sports writing job. Except the Abilene Reporter News decided they wanted me, and they said if I'd come to Reporter News, I could cover Hardin Simmons, which was being coached at that time by Sammy Ball. And I couldn't turn that down, so I went to Abilene. And then, and worked there, and I was there a year and there was, I'd come to the Cotton Bowl, and when I was working sports at Denton, I had met the AP bureau chief, a sports editor, Harold Ratliff. And so when I was at the Cotton Bowl, I saw Harold was over there writing, and I went over there to him and said hi and everything. And he says, hey, he says, hi. Mike says, let me finish this story I'm working on, and I'll buy you a drink. Well, of course, we were in the press room, so the drinks were free. That's why and so at any rate, after a while, he came over to the bar, and we had a drink, and he says, so you really do want to work for the Associated Press? And it just hit me by total surprise. And I said, well, sure, yeah. And he says, okay, I'll see what I can do. He says the bureau chief will, his wife is ill and he's having to deal with some stuff. But once we get through that, I'll see what we can do. And I said, well, I wanted to succeed Harold Ratliff, who would be retiring before long. And I thought, boy, that sounds great. Well, about 3 months later, in March, I guess it was, I got a call from Ratliff, and he says, do you still want to work for the AP? And, of course, I don't know who it was that had asked him for the job, but I said, you bet I do. That's what I said. I really do. He says, okay. And he put Bill Bernard on the phone. And Bill says, listen, he said, Harold has said some nice things. The next time you're in Dallas, come by and we'll discuss this. And I said, hey, that's great. And that day, one of those terrible West Texas dust storms blew in. I mean, just awful. It just things that just drive you dip. You can't see or anything. So I called Sandra. She was working at Hendricks Hospital in Abilene, and and said, listen, we'll both be off tomorrow. Go by when you get off and pick up our puppy. We're going to Dallas. So we did. We drove to Dallas. I put on the only sport coat and tie I think that I owned. And when Bill Bernard came into the office the next morning at the Associated Press, there I sat. And he was so astounded that there I was, that after talking to him the day before, that he said, you're hired. And he says, if you work out, that'll be fine. And if you don't, or if you don't like us or whatever, I'll get you a job in any newspaper you want in Texas. And, of course, I hopped into the AP and loved it. And a year later, I was assigned to open the Fort Worth Bureau at the Star-Telegram. And I just was absolutely astounded. And any rate, everything that like I say, everything kind of traces back to Pop Shuford and whatever. But when the after we worked out with the AP, and I became a roving correspondent and was traveling Texas, and I was just felt like this was the greatest job in the whole world. And Pop died, and I asked and received permission to write a story about him, and I did. I wrote a story and went nationally on Pop. He was a renowned poetry author as well as a national journalism figure. And of course, he and Dallas writer author Hugh Ainsworth were really two of my major journalistic inspirations. So I did. I wrote the story about Pop Shuford, and I ended the story by telling them what I just told y'all about the pay cut job deal, and I ended the story by saying, "Thank you, Pop," and I almost teared up when I did that. But at any rate, I'm asked frequently about the high point of my nearly half a century of reporting, and certainly there was no bigger story than the assassination of President Kennedy. I had opened the AP's Fort Worth Bureau at the Star-Telegram in January 1961, and I was at the Hotel Texas when he spoke that November morning in 1963. By no means was I the main AP writer that day, but I was there to assist a couple of our world-famous AP writers traveling and reporting on JFK's Texas appearances. I had phoned in a so-called floating bulletin that the presidential party's plane had departed Carswell Air Force Base for the short hop to Dallas, and wife Sandra dropped me off at the Carswell Air Force Base. At the office. A few minutes later, copy boy Guy Ham, responding to bells on the AP printing machine, shouted that Kennedy had been shot. Well, Sandra had run off to the beauty shop in the car. So I jumped in a car with Jack Tinsley and other Star-Telegram staffers and headed to Parkland Hospital. Or they were headed, and I went with them. We did not know the president was dead until several sobbing nurses came stumbling down a hallway. I remained at the hospital after almost every reporter and photographer had left, and I phoned the Dallas Bureau after each medical report on the wounded Texas Governor John Connally. I returned to Fort Worth Sunday morning to shower and change clothes when Sandra, watching TV, screamed that Lee Harvey Oswald had been shot by Jack Ruby. I raced back to Dallas, but returned to cover the Oswald funeral on Monday at Rose Hill Cemetery. Of course, his mother, Marguerite, lived in Fort Worth. I was chatting with Jerry Flemings that afternoon at Rose Hill when we realized there was nobody there to carry the casket. Jerry turned to me and exclaimed, quote, "If we're going to write a story about the burial of Lee Harvey Oswald, we're going to have to bury that son of a bitch ourselves." And we did. But when Police Chief Cato Hightower asked me if I would be a pallbearer, I not only said no, I said hell no. And then a much brighter reporter from our opposition news service, United Press International, UPI, stepped up and said he would help carry the casket. Well, like I say, I wasn't very bright, but I wasn't totally stupid. And I quickly said, I changed my mind. I will be a pallbearer. 50 years later, on the anniversary, I was on Face the Nation with CBS legend Bob Schieffer and Hugh Ainsworth talking about that episode hell no, I'm not going to do that. In the wake of all that, occurred after the assassination, I interviewed Mother Marguerite Oswald and widow Maureen Oswald and covered the Jack Ruby trial, investigated numerous conspiracy theories. I became exposed to many of the best writers in the world and abandoned my scheme to try to succeed the Texas AP sports editor, Harold Ratliff, who was nearing retirement. Among the other major stories was the U.S. space program, including the Apollo 11 moon landing mission and the Challenger and Columbia shuttle explosions. I spent a week in Austin covering sniper Charles Whitman and the University of Texas tower shooting. Other noted endeavors included the deadly tornadoes in Lubbock, Wichita Falls, and Fort Worth, and the horrific Mexico City earthquake that killed thousands in 1985. I reported on too many murder cases and murder trials to recount, but nothing matched, for me, the story of Fort Worth millionaire T. Cullen Davis, accused in the 1976 shooting of four persons at the $6 million mansion, killing 2 and critically wounding 2. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are aware that he was never convicted in criminal trials in Amarillo, Houston, and Fort Worth, but fared less successfully in several civil trials. And I covered all of them. And 2 of my 6 books focused on the never-ending Davis affair. One of my books, a trilogy of Texas crimes, involved the Walker Rayleigh case, the story of the Dallas minister accused of attempting to kill his wife. In one of my strangest assignments ever, I covered the Rayleigh trial in San Antonio while also covering the Branch Davidian saga near Waco. Sounds impossible. But for several weeks during the Davidian ordeal, I spent weekends in Waco with the Davidians and weekdays in the San Antonio courtroom. And both were disasters. Rayleigh was acquitted, and most of the Davidians died in a fire. And in another strange episode, probably one of the biggest stories I ever broke on the Cullen Davis drama, came shortly after Wes Turner welcomed me to his newspaper. The late Ray Hudson, Cullen's wife, Karen's father, summoned me to his lake home in Oklahoma and revealed a blockbuster. During the Amarillo murder trial, Cullen had been paying a popular district attorney's investigator $5,000 a month to secretly provide information daily on the prosecution's trial strategies and other critical actions. 23 years earlier, I had told Chief Prosecutor Joe Shannon, who's here tonight, that Hudson seemed to have secret knowledge of the prosecution's private strategies that he'd laugh about over a beer with me during the trial. I thought Hudson might have somehow bugged the hotel room where the prosecution team met each night to discuss the trial issues. Shannon ordered the room checked thoroughly, but of course found no bugging device. But Hudson had told me after the verdict in Amarillo that one of these days he might tell me what all went on during the trial. He contacted me in 2000 to say he had suffered a heart attack and didn't want to take his secrets to the grave. It made a hell of a story. I spent 3 days up at the lake, at his lake home with him in Oklahoma. And it was just a hell of a story. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And anyway, Karen's father, Ray Hudson, died several months ago. At any rate, it's just, I can't even explain what all this has been and what it's been like. And I can't express my gratification to many of you all who are here tonight for me to share this wonderful moment with y'all. I'm going to wrap this up quickly. But everybody here who knows my lovely auburn-haired wife, Sandra, realizes I'd never be here tonight without her. Her love and stability permitted me to pursue the roving journalism career I embraced, while she took the lead in raising our 2 children and a slew of pets, mostly dachshunds and a few stray cats. Barring something unseen, we'll celebrate our 60th wedding anniversary next year. Even my dearest friends, many of you are here tonight, are astounded at her incredible tolerance. Honey, please stand. And in closing, let me say, after this grand honor, let me say just one more time, thank you, Pop, and thank y'all.